So the first question you asked me as we were jumping on was, Wade, how do you scale a business? And there have been several books written around this of making that leap from the being the person who had a great idea or had a really great skill and started a business around it. And I think those are the two. That's where you first have to understand where you're at. There are practitioners or people who have really amazing skills: plumbers, carpenters, doctors, dentists, attorneys. You could be a consultant. You could be an accountant. You could be anything. Dog groomer. You could be the best dog groomer in the city, right? It doesn't matter what that practitioner or skill you have is, but you realize at one point it'd be better if you did this in your own business with your own controls, and then you would reap the benefits of that and make more money. So that's an entrepreneur who has a practitioner or has a skill, and they want to build a business around it. We'll talk about them in a second. Second example, which is one that is more known and the one we focus on in entrepreneurship, is the individual who has an idea, this moment of brilliance, whether it was Steve Jobs with the Apple computer, Steve and Steve Wozniak, or whether it was Bill Gates and the operating system, or Henry Ford in the car, or Sarah with the Spanx. I mean, there's always this brilliant idea that comes up, and then someone takes it to market. And so as we look at that, you have to decide which you are, because it will really make a big difference in how you scale the business. For example, start with the first example, the practitioner. The practitioner is going to go out there and first generate revenue and business using their skills, their influence. And if they want to scale, they've got to build a system. They've got to build a system that will teach other people to perform at the same level they have performed at, because in theory, the reason they're doing it on their own is they're so good and they're in such demand that people want them. Well, you'll never grow or scale unless you figure out how to teach that, how to transfer your DNA to the next employee and the next employee. And then once you get to 3 or 4 employees, you have to stop delivering that service or stop delivering that product, and you have to start relying on other people to do it. So whether you're in manufacturing and you're manufacturing something, or you're a mason and you're building something, it really doesn't matter. At some point, around 3 to 5 employees, you have to make this pivot to working on the business and not in it. If you want to know more about that, there's this great book written in the 90s. It's actually the book that I read, someone suggested to me when I got into entrepreneurship, called The E-Myth. And that book will give you really the guidelines if you're in that role. You think you could do something better. You can paint cars better than anybody. Probably the example most of you know, because you have friends probably doing this, is you can mow lawns better than anybody. That's a difficult one because it's a commodity business and anybody can do it. The barrier to entry is very, very low, and so there's a lot of competition. We can talk about that in another subject. Now let's talk about the brilliant idea or the entrepreneur who has this concept. So Sarah at Spanx is a great example of that. So if you hear her story, she's got some hilarious stories. She tells, and she's married to Jesse Itzler now, and he's the guy who started Marquis Jets, and he wrote the book Living with a Seal, and really funny guy, big speaker now. Him and his wife both are. But Sarah, when she started Spanx, she was going to an event. She didn't like the way she looked at her dress, so she took a pair of pantyhose, cut off the bottom, and only wore the top part. Now, I'm not a lady, and I've never worn pantyhose, but it makes sense to me. She was able to shape the dress the way she wanted to. And so she's like, this is a brilliant idea. Why don't they sell these? And so she started to create Spanx, and then she started to sell Spanx. And then eventually, what happens in that role with a brilliant idea is you could only make and sell so many of the brilliant idea you had, and now you have to hire staff to help you do that. There's still DNA transfer, but it's less about developing systems. You always have to develop processes and systems, but it's more about finding the right cogs to put into the machine. So at one point, you might need someone who's really good at operations, who can make the Spanx. At one point, you might need someone really good at finance who can help you track all the orders. At one point, you might need someone who's really good at shipping to help you make sure you're getting it out. And even here locally in West Michigan, and I don't mean to keep using women's apparel, but it's a great example. There's a company called SheFit, and it just happens to be a lady who owns that. Her name's Sarah as well. And she's a great example. She went from, she needed a better sports bra, and so she designed one because unfortunately sports bras aren't necessarily designed by women. And in this case, it was designed by a woman exactly the way she wanted it. And so she went from selling a couple $100,000 of these in a year to now she's selling millions and millions right here in Michigan, in Jenison, right outside Grand Rapids. So the point I'm trying to make is when both Sarahs, as they grew, as they scaled, those critical thing was obviously always developing process. That's really, really important. And we'll get into some of the tools and more specifics what that means. But also, it was about hiring the right person for the role. Now, sometimes people, when you're small, have to wear multiple hats. Both Sarahs wore every hat in the business when it was just them, or them and their husband. But eventually, you have to hire more people. And so it's all about getting the right person in the right seat. And Jim Collins introduced us to this idea in Good to Great back in 2001. It's a 20-year anniversary here in 2021. And so that's what you have to figure out. Which type of entrepreneur are you? Now, before you scale, you've got to get to enough revenue you could actually afford employees. So if you look at Elon Musk's story and you look at before he joined PayPal and merged with PayPal and he was developing his own online payment system, he tells stories about staying up until 3 a.m. coding, getting up at 6, making sales calls for a couple hours, and then going and working on website development, and then working on financing deals, and then coding the rest of the night and waking up next morning. He was wearing every hat in his startup. But eventually you hand that off to people who actually are probably better than you, and then you get that snowball effect where you just start growing and growing and growing. So 2 different business types. That's not all the business types, but those are the big ones whenever you're talking about entrepreneurship and innovation. And the final comment on this, and I think a professor at Harvard, I'm blanking on his name, but he wrote the Innovator's Dilemma. It really lays this out. If you are the innovator and you are a Sarah and you've developed the SheFit sports bra, or you develop Spanx, or you develop something like that, you want to go read the Innovator's Dilemma, because it talks about how do you bridge that moment of inspiration to getting large enough and enough revenue and enough belief in your product that someone's willing to pay you, and then you go hire the right people. Final thing on this, and I know you probably want to break in, Chris, but final thing is this is where angel investors come in. If you're the innovator, a lot of times you can't get money from the bank, and so they used to say you had the 3 F's: family, friends, and fools. And now you add angel investors to that 3 F's category. But someone has, or you self-fund it, someone has to help you do that. So I gotta take a breath here. I'm sure there's quite a few questions you have. But as you put yourself in that mindset, you have to figure out which you are, and then everybody has to overcome the biggest hurdle of all: getting enough revenue or raising enough revenue, one of the two, so that you can now get the right seats on the bus.